Thanks very much, Kathleen and Dina. I think there's a lot going on in this analysis. And looking forward to picking out some of the strands. There's also some interesting areas which I think are implicit. I can remember a couple of years ago seeing Secretary General in Souza of the OES talk about Chile's development path and put a big stress on a social contract that provided assurances of rights for workers, but also stable and predictable assurances of, rights, positions for investors. And he attributed a positive development path to the politics of achieving that, which I think is kind of implicit in a lot of your presentation. But many thanks for that. And now let's move quickly to our discussants. Stefan.
Right. Well, thank you very much. I was going to, actually Andy has already more or less touched on one point I wasn't going to make, which basically saying, I could take the lens here and say, let me look at it from a political economy point of view. And I don't think you quite do that in the report as much. And I'm sure there's plenty of people in the room that want to make that point, so I will not try to make it here. And I want to focus, and in fact, I want to focus just on the key elements, on the economics around it. And I think I should stick to my comparative advantage, I suppose. I have essentially 4 points I would like to make. And so the first one is to really, and I think it's also from the point of view of DFID, to welcome very much a report like this. I think it is it's in a high quality way. It brings it offers lots of sensible description. We never should forget the art of sensible description. A really good synthesis and a coherent narrative, and all the time trying to go back to some reasonably high quality or largely high quality sources of material. Okay, and I'm stressing this because I think for a reader that wants to use it, a real reader, the real person that wants to use it, should occasionally go back to some of these sources, because the problem with the WDR is trying to make a coherent narrative of an incoherent literature. And you have to work very hard, and I can see, given an earlier version I saw, the editor did a very good job. But that's not a criticism. It's important that we do that, and there's a coherence there. So in a sense, can we actually, around jobs, and that's what you do, some very diverse bits of work that lots of people say lots of things. Either they emphasize it or de-emphasize it, but they actually say lots of things that are relevant for putting the piece together. So that's actually really good. And I probably kind of, with my researcher hat on, I would say, well, I wish you had been able to answer some more of the open questions that you have, because even on the list of the questions that you had, what the policy makers are interested in, quite a few of your boxes end with saying, well, I actually don't quite know, which is actually, in a sense, where I'm sitting in DFID, is the same kind of thing. You can see it is a lens that is very crucial, but actually knowing very well what exactly to do, you not always get a clear package of what to do. So in a sense, if it puts us at ease in saying I'm not alone in not knowing it, it's quite good and it's good. So, but I would say this is not meant to be a criticism. I could make criticism on earlier WDRs that actually are far less careful than this one. So I will not go into which ones. So in that sense, I think the message wasn't dominating over the content and the basis of the argument. So that's really good. From a DFID point of view, I think, we would very much also, and I think it's something in recent times, DFID has very much moved to it, and re-recognizing the whole jobs agenda. Of course, there's recent events, and, whether we go back to Arab Spring or even earlier things, say, look, surely something is happening. We see Africa growing very fast. We're not seeing so much movement into these things. For DFID also, increasingly, we want to put that back into the core of what's going on into in our thinking about growth and how it brings development and poverty reduction. And it's very much a central part in it. And I do very much welcome also this emphasis. Looking at a lot of countries, it's actually typically much more in richer economies where benefit systems are the ones that bring people out of poverty. Maybe middle-income countries as well. We can name a few Latin Americans where it's been crucial, but it's very much the lower income countries, we more and more have to go to these processes. Now, that's all very good, and I very much welcome also the very, very last point you made, because reading even your executive summary, I didn't come out so strongly. What about the numbers? And I think it's, I'm glad the ILO colleagues are also emphasizing it, because they're producing these numbers for a very long time, but we can't quite use them. Sorry, this is on the record. Yes, it's very hard to use them. It's very hard to use them. It's very hard to know actually what the meaning of any of these statistics is. And I will be very honest that the advice I give to colleagues in DFID up to now is saying, well, don't even try to quote an unemployment figure because I don't believe it. I don't quote it for any kind of low-income countries. Maybe for middle-income countries you can, but that's not the entry. And therefore, the jobs rather than the unemployment angle is clearly where we need to come to. But we are clearly a long way away where maybe many of us, maybe given that you're attending all this, maybe most of us would say welcome. Wouldn't it be great to have here a table, just as we have on income poverty, and saying, you know, there are good jobs in the world, progress, and doubling the good jobs in the world in each country or whatever. We would be very far from that, and maybe some of the work you're doing, but it's something clearly after so many years, everybody knowing it's important, we're not doing very well on that. And I don't think it's rocket science, it's actually just, there's a lot of common sense in that involved as well. Anyway, that's the second point. You know, from a different point of view, we welcome this very much and also recognize that as an actionable tool in terms of targets and numbers, it's not an easy area to work on given that kind of problem. The third thing I think we all, definitely also in DFID, we would welcome very much, and I personally also would think it's really right in saying, you know, ultimately it's about private sector growth. Job creation is about private sector growth and getting some of these things going. And I really like the fact, and you emphasize it several times here, and I hope you keep on doing it, and it comes out, let me say that with some more senior people in the bank recently, they didn't bring that out and said that was a big lesson. So I think you have a job to do in the bank as well. It's not about labor market policy necessarily. It is something about some other things as well. It's not quite labor market policies. Makes it different. You talk about the fundamentals, surely, but you could say, well, that's maybe any private sector growth. But that's not what you're trying to say. Not just any private sector growth will necessarily deliver these jobs. But then we get a little bit stuck in general, and I think the knowledge is there. They're very, very, very fair. But let me come to that on some of the things you propose and comment a bit further on that. But actually come back to the labor market policies because, and I want to actually, given that I know in the text it's more careful because I worry about the possible misunderstanding of something Kathleen said, and I want to comment on that, is actually, you know, the fact that most of the jobs in poor countries are in micro enterprises doesn't mean that the growth in employment in good jobs will have to come from there, and that's not what the report is making as a point either. We need to focus on micro enterprises and farms, but there's no necessity from that. If all the poor jobs are in these sectors, doesn't mean that we have to focus on these sectors to actually get good jobs created, which is a very complicated thing. We know typically micro enterprises and farms have still the lower labor productivity jobs in the developing world. Getting that kind of transformation remains very difficult. And then it comes to this kind of tricky bit, okay, what do we then really do? It's a harder one. And I wish we would be further, and I wish the report was probably further, and I wish that we could be a DFID further in properly understanding what to do. It's, you know, it's not just the fundamentals. Fundamentals are crucial, and we should just not forget about them. You mentioned certain things, you know, things that will allow the agglomeration effects in cities to work, maybe the productivity increases in smallholder agriculture, and indeed the interaction between these two of them, as was mentioned towards the end on migration streams. These are sensible things. These are not easily engineered. How you do that? How do you start an agglomeration effect? It's not something we kind of well, maybe it's a very hard one to do. The same one, which is this context where we're sitting, I think, where we have the biggest demand for something sensible and we have the least supply of something sensible, I think, not just the report, but in general, how do we get in these countries where we know that because of relative price booms for natural resources, we have really very high growth, but the real problems, and not just about the fundamentals, not just about the rule of law or the transparency and the management of these resources, but what do you really do in this kind of context where your incentives in the economy get screwed up entirely, Dutch disease and incentives for institutional instabilities, and what you then do? How do you actually do diversification? I think probably the early 70s, when I probably, as a very young kid, was reading the first thing, I think probably the word diversification is important, was probably mentioned then, and we need to keep on thinking that as well. So how can we get a bit more about it? So finally then, so I would simply say it's a very good state of knowledge of what we can do. I'm not entirely sure we can really, you know, the case studies are helpful in this chapter 6, thinking through it, but how do you engineer that in Nigeria, say for natural resources, I would be quite, would still find it a hard job. But from DFID point of view, we would love to keep on working on this and trying to think more about these things. So the final point is that I take away from it, if I learned one thing about reading this report about jobs, is that probably by trying to do too much about jobs and labor markets, you're probably not going to do it. And so don't do too much about jobs directly. And in fact, shifting the debate about job creation away from jobs is probably actually a very sensible thing here in this respect. Because, as you were saying towards the end, a lot of the constraints that actually result in growth creating jobs may not be on the labor market itself, but not small with other processes in the economy that you're having. And I think that's definitely something I find very familiar. But of course, the person who's been in an international agency given the task to work on jobs is not necessarily so pleased with that. So this is the kind of balance we have to find. How do we actually bring jobs across? And in fact, if I learn one thing, it's across all the agendas that you do. It's you think about jobs, but you don't bet one person in your Department for International Development like ours to get in charge for jobs, because that's probably not going to have a huge impact. I'll leave it there. Thank you.